Two children she's never seen before walk into her diner, holding hands, looking exactly like her twins. "Are you Jasmine Carter?" the little girl asks. "Our daddy said we could find our brother and sister here." Outside, a black Mercedes idles at the curb. 5 years of silence, shattered in 30 seconds. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. The hospital hallway smelled like disinfectant and broken promises. Jasmine Carter gripped the cold metal railing, her knuckles turning ashy against her dark skin as another contraction ripped through her body like lightning splitting a tree. She bit down on her bottom lip hard enough to taste copper, refusing to scream, refusing to give the nurses rushing past another reason to look at her with that particular mixture of pity and judgment she'd been seeing for the past 6 hours. "Where is he?" she thought for the 100th time, her phone clutched in her sweaty palm, the screen black and silent as a tomb. Marcus hadn't answered any of her 12 calls, hadn't responded to the increasingly desperate texts that had devolved from loving updates to pleading questions to, finally, just, "Please. The baby's coming. I need you." The contraction passed and she sagged against the wall, her hospital gown twisted around her swollen belly, her feet bare against the cold linoleum because she'd been in such a rush when her water broke that morning that she'd forgotten shoes. Again. It seemed like she was always forgetting something lately, her brain foggy with pregnancy hormones and the constant low-grade anxiety that had become her companion ever since Marcus started working late, staying at the office, taking calls in the other room with the door closed, and his voice dropping to a whisper whenever she walked by. "You're being paranoid," he'd told her 3 weeks ago when she'd found a receipt for dinner at Rousseau's, the French restaurant where he'd proposed to her 2 years earlier. Except this receipt was for 2 people, and she'd been home that night, eating microwaved leftovers because her back hurt too much to cook. "It was a business dinner, babe. You know how important this merger is." She'd wanted to believe him. God. She'd wanted to believe him so badly that she'd swallowed the doubt like bitter medicine and told herself that successful men had busy lives, that Marcus Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries, heir to a real estate fortune that made her head spin, couldn't be expected to hold her hand through every ache and pain of pregnancy. Except this wasn't an ache or a pain. This was labor. This was their children, twins, a boy and a girl, about to enter the world, and he couldn't even answer his phone. "Ma'am?" A nurse appeared at her elbow, young and tired-looking with blonde hair escaping from her ponytail. "You really need to get back to your room. You're dilated to 7 centimeters. This baby isn't going to wait much longer." Jasmine nodded, letting the nurse guide her back down the hallway, each step feeling like walking through water. Her body no longer entirely her own, but hijacked by the biological imperative to push these babies out whether she was ready or not. And she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to do this alone. Wasn't ready to be the single mother she'd sworn she'd never become. Wasn't ready to explain to her children someday why their father, who had everything, had chosen to give them nothing. The delivery room was too bright. All harsh fluorescent lights and beeping monitors and the obstetrician's calm professional face that somehow made everything worse because it meant this was routine for her. Just another Tuesday. Just another woman about to split herself open to bring life into an indifferent world. "Push," the doctor said, and Jasmine pushed, her hands gripping the rails of the bed so hard she thought her bones might snap. Her throat raw from screaming despite her earlier resolution, because pain this enormous demanded sound, demanded acknowledgement, demanded witness, even if the only person who should have been witnessing wasn't there. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. Seconds lasted hours. Hours collapsed into moments. And then suddenly, impossibly, there was a cry, high and thin and furious. And the doctor was saying, "It's a girl, healthy and perfect," and placing a tiny squirming body on Jasmine's chest. She looked down at her daughter through tears that blurred everything into watercolor shapes, at this impossibly small person with a crown of dark curls and skin the color of warm honey, a perfect blend of her and Marcus, and felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with physical pain. This was terror, and love fused into something so intense. It felt like dying and being reborn at the same time. 5 minutes later, her son arrived with less drama, sliding into the world as if he'd been waiting politely for his sister to go first. And when they laid him on her other side, Jasmine understood with sudden, devastating clarity that she would kill for these children, would die for them, would do anything and everything to protect them, even if it meant protecting them from their own father's indifference. "Where is he?" the nurse asked gently. "The baby's father." And Jasmine heard herself say, "He's at work. Important meeting. Couldn't get away." The lies tasting like ash in her mouth, but easier than the truth, which was that she didn't know, had no idea, couldn't begin to explain why the man who'd gotten down on one knee in front of 100 people and promised her forever had disappeared when forever arrived, demanding diapers and midnight feedings and the kind of love that asked for everything and gave back more. They wheeled her to a recovery room eventually, both babies asleep in plastic bassinets beside her bed. And Jasmine reached for her phone with hands that trembled from exhaustion and something darker, something she didn't want to name. 27 missed calls, all from her best friend Valencia, none from Marcus. She dialed Valencia's number and listened to it ring once before her friend's voice exploded through the speaker. "Jazz. Oh my God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Are you okay? Did you have the babies, and why the hell didn't you call me back? You scared me half to death." "I was in labor," Jasmine said, her voice flat and strange to her own ears. "They're here, a boy and a girl. They're perfect." "And Marcus?" Valencia asked, and Jasmine heard the careful way she said his name, like she was afraid of the answer. "Still not here." "Jazz, honey, listen to me." Valencia's voice dropped, became serious in a way that made Jasmine's stomach clench. "Don't freak out, okay? But I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it. I saw Marcus today, at the Four Seasons, with someone, with a woman. Blonde, expensive looking, and Jazz, they were holding hands. They went into the hotel together." Jasmine felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one landing with precision, targeting the parts of her that had been trying so hard to believe, to trust, to hope. "Who?" she managed to say. "I don't know. I didn't recognize her. But Jazz, I took pictures. I'm texting them to you now. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The photos arrived seconds later, and Jasmine opened them with hands that had gone numb, her body understanding before her brain could catch up that this was the moment, the line of demarcation between before and after, between who she'd been and who she'd have to become. There was Marcus in his gray Tom Ford suit, the one she'd helped him pick out last month, the one he'd said made him feel invincible. There was Marcus opening a car door for a woman Jasmine had never seen before, tall and elegant with the kind of casual wealth that showed in the way she carried herself, like the world would rearrange itself to accommodate her, and she knew it. There was Marcus's hand on the small of this woman's back, proprietary and intimate, the same way he used to touch Jasmine back when he still touched her at all. And there was Marcus walking into the Four Seasons, not looking back, while Jasmine lay in a hospital bed 20 minutes away, bleeding and exhausted and holding his children in her arms. She called him. She didn't know why, what she thought would happen, what she hoped he would say. But she called him, and this time, finally, he answered. "Marcus," she said, and her voice cracked on his name. "Where are you? I had the babies. Our children are here and you weren't. You promised you'd be here and you weren't. Why weren't you here?" And on the other end of the line there was a pause, the kind of pause that precedes the end of worlds. "Jazz," he said, and she hated how tired he sounded, how burdened, like she was the problem. "I can't do this right now. I'm in the middle of something important." "The babies are here," she repeated, because maybe he hadn't understood, maybe he'd forgotten, maybe there was some explanation that would make this make sense. "Marcus, we have a son and a daughter. They need you. I need you." There was another pause, and then, "I know this is hard to hear, but I don't think this is going to work out. U.S. This. I've been trying to find the right time to tell you, but there never seemed to be a good moment, and now, well, now you've had the kids, and maybe it's better to be honest. I'm not ready for this. For them. For the kind of life you want. And there's someone else. Someone who understands my world better. And I think we'd both be happier if we ended this cleanly." The babies, Jasmine said, because her brain couldn't process anything else, had narrowed down to this one essential fact. You have 2 children. They're 6 hours old. And you're... What? You're breaking up with me over the phone while I'm in the hospital. It's better this way, Marcus said. And he sounded almost relieved, like he'd been carrying this weight and was finally setting it down, transferring it to her shoulders instead. You'll be fine. I'll make sure you're taken care of financially. You can stay in the apartment for another month while you figure things out. I'm having the locks changed tomorrow, so don't try to come back tonight. I need my space to think clearly about next steps. The line went dead, and Jasmine stared at her phone, at her reflection in the black screen, at this stranger with wild hair and hollow eyes who apparently lived in her skin now. The locks. He was changing the locks. On the apartment they'd shared for 2 years. The apartment she'd decorated and cleaned and transformed from his sterile bachelor pad into something like a home. The apartment where all her clothes lived, her books, her grandmother's quilt, the hand-carved wooden box her father had made before he died. The only thing she had left of him. He was changing the locks, and she was here, trapped in this hospital bed with 2 newborns and nowhere to go and no way to get there even if she did. Because her feet were still swollen and she still didn't have any shoes. "Valencia?" she said when her friend answered on the first ring. "Can you come get me? Please. I need to go home. I need to get my things before I can't." "I'm already in the car," Valencia said. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. And Jazz, wherever you need to go, whatever you need to do, I'm with you. All the way." But the thing was, Jasmine realized as she hung up and looked down at her sleeping babies, their tiny chests rising and falling with breath that seemed impossibly fragile. She had no idea where she needed to go. She'd built her entire adult life around Marcus, had molded herself into the shape of the woman she thought he needed, had given up the scholarship to grad school when he'd said he needed her support during the Blackstone acquisition, had lost touch with friends who asked too many questions about why he never seemed to have time for her, had ignored the signs, ignored the distance, ignored the voice in her head that kept whispering that something was wrong, something was broken, something was ending. And now it had ended, not with the dramatic confrontation she'd sometimes imagined in her darkest moments, but with a phone call and a warning about changed locks and the casual cruelty of a man who could look at photographs of his newborn children and feel nothing stronger than inconvenience. She gathered the babies close, breathing in their powder-soft smell, memorizing the weight of them, the warmth, trying to find in their existence some kind of anchor, some reason to believe she could survive this. They needed names, she realized suddenly. She and Marcus had picked names months ago, arguing playfully about whether to honor his grandfather or her mother, finally settling on Elijah Marcus Whitmore for the boy and Gabriel Rose Whitmore for the girl. But she wasn't giving these children his name, wasn't marking them as his when he'd made it clear they meant nothing to him. "Elijah Carter," she whispered to her son, and Gabrielle Carter to her daughter. "You're mine. Only mine. And I promise you both. He might not want you, but I do. I want you so much it feels like my heart is breaking and healing at the same time. I don't know how we're going to do this, but we will. We'll figure it out. We have to." Valencia arrived like a whirlwind of righteous fury, her braids wrapped in a bright purple scarf, her eyes blazing with the kind of anger that came from loving someone enough to want to destroy whoever hurt them. She took one look at Jasmine's face and said, "Okay, we're getting you out of here. We're going to your apartment, and we're taking everything you own before that bastard can touch it." "The nurses say I need to stay for observation," Jasmine said weakly. "The nurses can observe you at my place," Valencia said flatly, already gathering the baby's things, stuffing diapers and onesies into a hospital-issued diaper bag with the kind of efficiency that came from being someone's best friend for 15 years. "You're not spending one more second in this place being sad while he's out there being happy. We're going to make him regret this. We're going to make him wish he'd never been born." But as they made their way out of the hospital, the babies strapped into car seats borrowed from the maternity ward, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that revenge was a luxury she couldn't afford. that all her energy would have to go toward simple survival, toward keeping these tiny humans alive and fed and warm, toward building a life from the wreckage of the one she'd thought she had. The apartment building loomed against the evening sky, all glass and steel and understated wealth. The kind of place that had always made Jasmine feel like an imposter even after 2 years of calling it home. She'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Bed-Stuy, shared a bathroom with 3 siblings, learned to sleep through sirens and shouting and the bass-heavy thump of music from the apartment below. This building had a doorman named Philip who knew everyone's name, and a marble lobby that echoed with the sound of expensive shoes on expensive floors. Philip's face went through a complicated series of expressions when he saw them. Valencia carrying both car seats with grim determination. Jasmine shuffling behind in borrowed hospital slippers, still bleeding into the industrial-strength pad the nurse had given her, her body screaming with every step but her will harder than the pain. "Congratulations on the babies, Miss Carter," Philip said carefully, and she could see him trying to figure out how much he was supposed to know, what he'd been told, whether he was meant to stop her. "Thank you," Jasmine said, and kept walking, kept putting one foot in front of the other, kept moving because if she stopped, she might never start again. The elevator ride took 100 years, Valencia muttering a steady stream of creative profanity under her breath, and then they were on the 17th floor, standing in front of apartment 1704. And Jasmine was reaching for her keys and finding them, miraculously, in her coat pocket where she'd shoved them 12 hours ago in another lifetime. The key turned in the lock and she felt a surge of relief so intense it made her dizzy, because at least this part of his threat had been empty. At least she could get inside. At least she could gather her things. The apartment was dark and quiet and smelled faintly of Marcus's cologne, a scent she'd once loved and now made her stomach turn. She flipped the light switch and froze. The apartment was empty. Not empty like he'd moved out, empty like he'd erased her, systematically removed every trace of her existence from the space they'd shared. Her grandmother's quilt, gone. The photos of her family that had hung in the hallway, gone. The bookshelf she'd spent weeks organizing by color and genre, completely empty. Her clothes, her shoes, her toiletries, the ceramic bowl she used to keep her jewelry, the plant she'd been nurturing for 3 years, the throw pillows she'd bought to make the sterile white couch feel more like home. All of it, gone. He'd taken everything. No, she realized as she walked through the rooms in a daze. Not taken, thrown away. Because sitting by the service entrance in the hallway was a pile of black garbage bags. And when she opened one with trembling hands, she found her clothes. Her beautiful clothes that she'd saved for her and carefully maintained, now wrinkled and reeking of something chemical, like he'd poured bleach over them to make sure they were ruined beyond rescue. Valencia made a sound like a wounded animal and Jasmine found herself laughing, a high brittle sound that didn't belong to her. "He bleached my clothes," she said wonderingly. "He actually bleached them." "Jazz," Valencia said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "We need to call the police. This is destruction of property. This is so many kinds of illegal." "What are they going to do?" Jasmine said, still laughing. "Arrest Marcus Whitmore, pillar of the community, for throwing away his ex-girlfriend's clothes. You think anyone cares what happens to me? You think this city protects people like us?" She was right, and they both knew it. The knowledge sitting between them like a third person in the room. Marcus had money and connections and lawyers who'd spin this into a story about a messy breakup, about a woman who'd refused to leave gracefully, about misunderstandings and he said she said. And Jasmine had 2 newborn babies and nowhere to live, and the clothes on her back that technically belonged to the hospital. They went through every garbage bag anyway, Valencia salvaging what could be saved while Jasmine nursed the babies, and tried not to think about the cosmic unfairness of breasts that could create life-sustaining milk, while the rest of her body felt like it was falling apart. She found her father's box in the last bag, the wood scratched and the hinges broken but the box itself intact, and she clutched it to her chest. And finally let herself cry, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere so deep they felt like they might turn her inside out. "I'm so sorry," Valencia said, holding her while she cried, rocking her like she was one of the babies. "I'm so sorry he did this to you. I'm sorry you trusted him. I'm sorry any of us thought he was better than this. Eventually the tears ran out and Jasmine was left hollow and exhausted, but somehow more clear-headed than she'd been in months. She looked around the apartment that wasn't hers anymore, that maybe had never really been hers, and understood that she'd been living in a fantasy, playing house with a man who'd seen her as temporary from the start. A pleasant distraction until something better came along. And she'd been so grateful for his attention, so eager to prove she belonged in his world, that she'd missed every sign that he was already halfway gone. "We need to go," she said, her voice steady now, empty of emotion, just a statement of fact. "Take whatever's not ruined, pack it in the car, and let's leave before he comes back." "Where are you going to go?" Valencia asked, and Jasmine realized she'd been avoiding thinking about this, about the practical reality of being homeless with 2 infants. "I don't know. A shelter, maybe. There are places for women with kids." "Not like this," Valencia said fiercely. "Not on your first night as a mother. You're coming home with me. My place is small, but we'll make it work. Aunt Rita won't mind. She loves babies." "I can't ask you to do that," Jasmine said, but she was already nodding, already accepting, because what choice did she have? What other option existed for someone with no money and no home, and 2 children who needed somewhere safe to sleep? They loaded Valencia's ancient Honda Civic with garbage bags full of salvaged clothes, the wooden box, a handful of books that had somehow survived, the nursing pillow the hospital had sent home with her, and the 2 car seats with the babies sleeping peacefully inside them, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Jasmine took one last look at the apartment, at this place where she'd been so happy once, or thought she'd been happy, and then she turned her back and walked away, leaving the key on the kitchen counter for Marcus to find, a small act of defiance that probably meant nothing but felt important anyway. As they drove through the city, the lights blurring past the windows, Jasmine felt something shift inside her, some fundamental recalibration of who she was and what she'd have to become. She'd been soft before, accommodating, willing to bend herself into whatever shape would make Marcus love her. But softness was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. These children needed someone hard enough to survive the world's cruelty, strong enough to build something from nothing, fierce enough to fight for their future when their own father had abandoned them before they were a day old. 5 years, she thought, as Valencia's apartment building came into view, small and shabby compared to Marcus's tower, but infinitely warmer, infinitely more real. 5 years, and he'll have forgotten we exist. 5 years, and he'll be married to that blonde woman and living the life he wanted, the life that didn't include us. And she was right about that. Mostly. Marcus did marry the blonde woman, did continue building his empire, did live the life he wanted. But he was wrong about one thing. He'd told Jasmine she'd be fine, like fine was something that just happened if you waited long enough. And she wasn't fine. She was broken and exhausted and terrified every single day. But she was also strong in a way she'd never known she could be. She was a mother. And that, it turned out, made all the difference.
5 years had a way of changing people, of taking who you thought you were and grinding it down until only the essential parts remained. Jasmine Carter, at 32, looked nothing like the soft, hopeful girl who'd walked out of that hospital with 2 newborns and nowhere to go. Her hair was still natural, but cut short now for practicality. Her hands were calloused from working double shifts at the diner, where tips were better on weekends if you laughed at bad jokes. And her eyes had developed a hardness that came from learning to say no, learning to fight, learning that the world didn't give you anything you didn't take yourself. The twins, Elijah and Gabrielle, had her smile and her stubbornness, and Marcus's sharp intelligence that sometimes scared her because she'd see them figure something out, some puzzle or problem, and catch a glimpse of their father in the way their faces lit up with understanding.
She tried not to think about Marcus often, had trained herself to redirect her thoughts whenever his name tried to surface. But sometimes she'd catch herself wondering if he ever thought about them, if he ever regretted walking away, if he ever woke up in the middle of the night and realized what he'd lost. Probably not. Valencia would say on the rare occasions Jasmine voiced these thoughts. Men like that don't have regrets. They have justifications, and they tell themselves stories about why everything they do is actually noble and necessary. They'd made it work somehow, The three of them crammed into Valencia's tiny apartment for 6 months, until Jasmine had saved enough for a security deposit on a place in a neighborhood that was technically still in the city, but felt like a different universe from Marcus's world of doormen and marble lobbies. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up that smelled like old cooking and had radiators that clanged like angry ghosts in the winter. But it was theirs, paid for with money she'd earned. And that made it beautiful in a way Marcus's sterile showcase had never been. She'd worked 3 jobs that first year, waitressing during the day while Valencia watched the twins, cleaning offices at night after they were asleep, and doing online data entry whenever she had a spare hour, her eyes burning from staring at the screen, but her fingers flying because every dollar mattered. Every cent was the difference between making rent and being back on the street. The twins had learned to talk at Valencia's place, their first words witnessed not by their absent father but by Valencia's Aunt Rita, who'd cried when Gabrielle said mama, and then immediately tried to eat the cat's tail. They'd taken their first steps in the narrow hallway of the apartment on a sweltering July afternoon, both of them letting go of the couch at the same time as if they'd planned it, as if they'd decided together that this was the moment to be brave. Jasmine had documented everything in a journal she kept hidden under her mattress, writing late at night when the twins were finally asleep and the city was quiet enough to hear yourself think. She wrote about Elijah's fascination with how things worked, how he'd taken apart Valencia's alarm clock at 3 years old and somehow put it back together, and about Gabrielle's fierce protectiveness, how she'd punched a boy at pre-K who'd called Elijah a name Jasmine still didn't want to repeat. She wrote about the hard days when she'd cried in the bathroom because she couldn't afford both groceries and the electric bill, and about the good days when the twins would curl up on either side of her, and they'd read the same worn library books over and over, their voices blending together in a chorus of make-believe and possibility. She never wrote about Marcus. She didn't need to. His absence was the story underneath every other story, the negative space that shaped everything they were and weren't, the ghost at every birthday party and school play and doctor's appointment. When the twins asked about their father, which they did with increasing frequency as they got older and noticed they were different from the other kids at school, Jasmine told them the truth, carefully edited for young ears. Your father wasn't ready to be a dad. Some people aren't built for the kind of love that asks for everything, and that's not your fault. That's his loss, because you two are the best thing that ever happened to me. Gabrielle had accepted this explanation with the pragmatism she brought to everything, shrugging and saying, "Then we don't need him. We have you and Valencia and Aunt Rita. That's enough." But Elijah had pressed, asking questions Jasmine couldn't always answer, wanting details about this man whose DNA he carried, but whose face he'd never seen, and she'd felt something in her chest crack every time because she knew what it was like to grow up without a father, knew the specific shape of that absence, and she'd sworn her children would never feel it. The thing was, they did feel it. She could see it in the way Elijah watched fathers at the playground, his eyes following them with an intensity that made her heart hurt, and in the way Gabrielle acted extra tough, extra independent, like she could armor herself against the vulnerability of wanting something she couldn't have. And there was nothing Jasmine could do except love them harder, work longer hours to give them things she'd never had, and try to be enough even though she knew intellectually that one person couldn't be both parents, couldn't fill a void that wasn't hers to fill. They'd built a life anyway, a good life, against all odds and expectations. The twins went to a decent public school where Jasmine volunteered in the library every week, so the teachers would remember her face, remember that these kids had someone who cared. They did homework at the kitchen table while Jasmine cooked dinner, usually pasta or rice with whatever vegetables were on sale, and they ate together every single night because that was one thing she'd decided mattered, one ritual that was sacred, that said they were a family even if they didn't look like the families on television. Gabrielle had inherited Jasmine's love of reading and could usually be found with her nose in a book, devouring fantasy novels about kids who discovered they had magic powers or secret destinies. Elijah was all about building things, his room a chaotic explosion of Lego sets and craft supplies and sketches of machines he wanted to invent someday when he grew up and was smart enough, though Jasmine constantly reminded him he was already the smartest kid she knew. They fought like siblings did, arguing about whose turn it was to pick the movie, or who'd eaten the last cookie. But they were also ferociously loyal to each other, a unit that had learned early that the world could be cruel and unpredictable, but they'd always have each other. And that was enough. Jasmine told herself on the hard days. That had to be enough. The diner where she'd been working for 4 years was called Rosie's, though there was no Rosie and never had been. Just a succession of owners who'd bought the place and kept the name because changing signs was expensive. It was the kind of place where truckers and construction workers came for coffee so strong it could strip paint, and breakfast served all day because who was anyone to tell you when you could eat eggs? Jasmine worked the morning shift, 6 to 2, which meant she was up at 4:30 to get herself ready and pack the twins' lunches and walk them to the bus stop by 7 before catching 2 trains to get to work. She was always tired, bone-deep tired, the kind of exhaustion that became normal after a while, and her feet ached constantly from standing on linoleum floors that had no give. But the tips were decent, and her boss, a gruff man named Tony who'd done time for something he wouldn't talk about, was flexible when she needed to leave early for school meetings, or when one of the twins got sick. This particular Tuesday started like any other, alarm screaming at 4:30. Jasmine hauling herself out of bed and into the shower that never quite got hot enough, dressing in the dark so she wouldn't wake the twins yet. She made oatmeal and cut up an apple and filled 2 water bottles, moving through the familiar routine with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. And then she went to wake Elijah and Gabriel, opening their door quietly and watching them for just a moment before she disturbed their peace. They slept in twin beds pushed close together, often ending up in the same bed by morning as if they couldn't bear to be separated even in sleep. And she felt the usual surge of fierce love mixed with fear, because loving someone this much meant having so much to lose. "Wake up, babies," she said softly, and Gabrielle's eyes snapped open immediately, alert and ready, while Elijah groaned and burrowed deeper into his pillow, buying 5 more minutes of unconsciousness. They went through the morning routine, breakfast eaten, while Gabrielle chattered about the science project she wanted to do on volcanoes, and Elijah slowly came to life, his brain not fully online until he'd had food and some time to adjust to being conscious. Jasmine braided Gabrielle's hair while Elijah packed their backpacks, double-checking that they had their homework, and their library books, and the permission slips she'd signed last night. And then they were bundling into coats because it was October, and the mornings had that sharp edge that promised winter was coming. She walked them to the bus stop 3 blocks away, kissed them both goodbye even though Elijah was starting to get self-conscious about public displays of affection, and watched the bus pull away with her heart in her throat like it was every single morning. Because what if something happened? What if this was the last time she saw them? What if she'd failed to protect them somehow? The subway was crowded with the morning crush of commuters, everyone studiously avoiding eye contact, and Jasmine found a spot by the door and let her mind drift, planning her day, mentally calculating whether she could pick up an extra shift on Saturday, or if that would mean missing Gabrielle's soccer game. The train lurched and swayed, and eventually deposited her at her stop, and she climbed the stairs to street level and walked the 4 blocks to Rosie's, arriving at 5:55 to find Tony already there, setting up for the day. "You're early," he grunted, and she said, "When am I not?" And he almost smiled, which was as close to warmth as Tony got. The morning passed in the usual blur of orders and coffee refills and small talk with regulars who came in at the same time every day and sat in the same seats and ordered the same things, creatures of habit finding comfort in repetition. Around 10:30, the door opened, and Jasmine looked up from wiping down table 6 to see something that made her freeze with the rag still in her hand, her brain refusing to process what her eyes were telling her. 2 children stood in the doorway, a boy and a girl, maybe 5 years old, and they were holding hands and looking around the diner with the kind of wide-eyed uncertainty kids got when they were somewhere unfamiliar. But that wasn't what made Jasmine's heart stop. What made her heart stop was that these children were white with brown hair and blue eyes. But they were also unmistakably familiar in a way that made no sense, their faces echoing features she saw every day, every time she looked at her own children. They had Elijah's serious expression and Gabrielle's determined chin, and something in the shape of their mouths that was pure Marcus. And Jasmine felt reality tilt sideways because this was impossible. This couldn't be happening. She'd had the only children Marcus had fathered. That was the whole point of the story. That was why his abandonment was so brutal and complete. The children scanned the diner, and then the little girl's face lit up, and she tugged her brother's hand and pointed. And they started walking toward Jasmine with purpose, weaving between tables, and Jasmine just stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything except watch as these impossible children approached her. "Excuse me," the little girl said politely. "Are you Jasmine Carter?" And somehow Jasmine managed to nod, managed to say, "Yes." And the little girl smiled, a smile that was eerily familiar, and said, "We're looking for our sister and brother Elijah and Gabrielle Carter, and our daddy said we could find them here because you're their mommy." The rag fell from Jasmine's hand and hit the floor with a wet slap that seemed impossibly loud. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out because her brain had short-circuited. Couldn't make sense of the words she just heard. Couldn't reconcile the existence of these children with everything she knew about her life. "Your daddy," she finally managed to say, and the little boy nodded and said in a voice much quieter than his sister's, "Marcus Whitmore. That's our daddy. And he said we have a brother and a sister who we didn't know about, but now we do. And he wants us to meet them." Tony appeared at Jasmine's elbow, his face concerned. "You okay, Jazz?" And she realized she must look as shocked as she felt. Must be pale or swaying or something. Because Tony wasn't the kind of man who noticed things like feelings unless they were really obvious. "I'm fine," she lied. And then to the children, "Where is your father? Why aren't you with him?" And the little girl's smile faltered. "He's in the car. He said to come in and find you first because he wasn't sure you'd want to see him. He said to tell you he's sorry, and he knows sorry isn't enough. But it's all he has." Jasmine felt rage bloom in her chest, hot and immediate. Because of course Marcus would send his children, other children, children she hadn't known existed, to do his emotional labor for him, to soften her up before he had to face her. And underneath the rage was confusion and hurt, and 1,000 questions, chief among them how he'd managed to have more children when he'd been so adamant that he wasn't ready for fatherhood. "Wait here," she told the children, and then to Tony, "Watch them, please. I need to handle something," and she was out the door before he could respond. There was a black Mercedes idling at the curb, one of those SUVs that cost more than Jasmine made in 3 years. And through the tinted windows, she could see a figure in the driver's seat. She strode over and yanked open the passenger door, and there he was, Marcus Whitmore, 5 years older, and somehow both exactly the same and completely different. He still had that perfect hair, those sharp cheekbones, that air of entitlement that came from never having to worry about money or consequences. But there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that might have been shame if she'd believed he was capable of it. "Jasmine," he started, and she cut him off with a voice so cold it could have frozen water. "You have 30 seconds to explain why your children I didn't know existed, just walked into my workplace asking about their siblings, and why you thought it was appropriate to send them in alone instead of having the decency to face me yourself." "You're right," he said. And she hated that his voice still did something to her, still triggered memories of when she'd loved him, when she'd thought he loved her back. "I'm a coward. I should have come in. But I wasn't sure you'd talk to me, and I thought maybe if Hannah and Henry met you first, you'd be more willing to hear me out." "Hannah and Henry," she repeated, tasting the names, hating that they were nice names, normal names, the kind of names Marcus had wanted to give their children before she'd cut him out of that decision. "And their mother. Where is she? Is she waiting in another car? Is this some kind of ambush? Are you here to tell me you want custody of Elijah and Gabriel now that you've decided fatherhood might be fun after all?" "Their mother is dead," Marcus said, and the flatness in his voice made Jasmine look at him sharply. "She died 8 months ago. Cancer. It was fast. And before she died, she made me promise to tell Hannah and Henry the truth about everything. About how I'd been a father before and walked away. About how they had siblings they'd never met. About how I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I was selfish and scared and stupid." Jasmine felt her anger waver, felt sympathy trying to creep in, and shoved it back down because she would not let him manipulate her with his dead wife and his orphaned children. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it despite everything. "But that doesn't explain why you're here. Why you tracked me down after 5 years of silence. Why you think you have any right to disrupt our lives." Because Hannah won't stop asking about her brother and sister, Marcus said. Because Henry draws pictures of kids he's never met and leaves them on my desk. Because I'm trying to be a better father to them than I was to Elijah and Gabriel. And part of that means not lying, not pretending that their siblings don't exist, not repeating my mistakes. And what about Elijah and Gabriel? Jasmine said, her voice shaking now with the effort of staying calm. What about what they need? What they deserve? Did you think about them at all in the last 5 years? Did it ever occur to you that they might want to know their father? That your absence might have hurt them in ways that can't be fixed with a surprise visit and some pretty words about not repeating mistakes? Every day, Marcus said, and his voice cracked. I thought about them every single day. But by the time I realized I'd made the worst mistake of my life, it had been months and then years, and I didn't know how to come back. Didn't know if I had the right. Didn't know if you'd even let me near them. And part of me thought maybe they were better off without me. Maybe I just messed them up the way my father messed me up. Maybe the kindest thing I could do was stay away. And then Caroline died, and Hannah started asking questions, and I realized that hiding from my mistakes wasn't protecting anyone. It was just making everything worse. Jasmine wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him exactly what his absence had cost. The nights Elijah had cried because he didn't understand why his daddy didn't want him. The way Gabrielle had built walls around her heart to protect herself from caring too much about someone who might leave. But before she could say any of that, the door to the diner opened, and Hannah and Henry came out, followed by Tony, who looked deeply uncomfortable, and Hannah called out, "Daddy, is everything okay?" And Jasmine saw Marcus's face soften in a way she'd never seen it soften before. Saw him look at these children with love that was so obvious it hurt to witness. "We're fine, sweetheart," he called back. "Give us just one more minute." He turned back to Jasmine and said, "I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm not asking to be their father because I gave up that right. I'm just asking if maybe they could meet their brother and sister. If maybe we could figure out a way to let them know each other. And if that's too much, if I've hurt you too badly for even that, then I'll leave and I won't bother you again. I swear." Jasmine looked at Hannah and Henry, standing uncertainly on the sidewalk, holding hands the same way Elijah and Gabriel did when they were nervous, and she thought about the twins, about how they'd always felt incomplete in some fundamental way, about how they'd asked for siblings more times than she could count. And she thought about herself, about the woman she'd become in the last 5 years, hard and practical, and determined to protect her children from anything that might hurt them. But she also thought about the journal under her mattress, about all the things she'd written about wanting better for her kids than she'd had, about wanting them to know they were loved and valued, and part of something bigger than just her and Valencia and Aunt Rita. These children, Hannah and Henry, they were innocent in all this. They didn't choose their father any more than Elijah and Gabriel did. And whatever Jasmine thought of Marcus, whatever he deserved or didn't deserve, these kids deserved to know their family. "Not today," she said finally. "You don't get to spring this on them without warning, without giving them time to process. But you can come to our apartment on Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock, and you can bring Hannah and Henry, and we'll introduce them and see how it goes. And if it goes badly, if my kids are upset or confused or hurt, then you leave, and you don't come back. But if it goes well, if they want to see each other again, then we'll figure something out. Some kind of arrangement that puts them first. Not you, not me, them." "Deal," Marcus said immediately, and the relief on his face was so naked she had to look away. She gave him the address, watching him save it in his phone, and then he called the twins over and introduced them properly. "Hannah, Henry, this is Miss Carter. She's Elijah and Gabrielle's mom, and you're going to meet them on Saturday. Is that okay?" The children nodded solemnly, and Hannah said, "Thank you for letting us meet them. We promise to be good." And Jasmine felt something twist in her chest because these kids had clearly been coached, had clearly been told that this meeting was a privilege that could be revoked, and she wondered what else Marcus had told them, what version of the story they'd heard. They all said goodbye, and Jasmine watched the Mercedes pull away and then stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, trying to figure out what had just happened. trying to understand how her careful, controlled life had just been blown apart by 2 children and a man she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. She went back into the diner where Tony was pretending to clean the coffee machine, but was clearly waiting for an explanation. "So that was interesting," he said carefully, and Jasmine laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "That was my children's father, who abandoned us the day they were born, showing up with his other kids to ask for a second chance at playing daddy." Tony whistled low. "That's heavy, Jazz. You okay?" "No," she said honestly, "but I will be. I have to be." The rest of her shift was a blur, her body going through the motions while her mind spun, trying to figure out how to tell Elijah and Gabriel what words to use, how to prepare them for Saturday without building it up too much or making them scared or excited or whatever reaction would be the worst one. She picked them up from school like always, listening to Gabrielle's animated story about how she'd scored a goal in gym class, and Elijah's quieter report about the math test he thought he'd done well on. And she told herself she'd wait until after dinner, until they'd had food, and were calm and ready to hear something big. But when they got home and she started making spaghetti, her hands shaking slightly as she boiled water and opened a jar of sauce that was on sale, Gabrielle looked at her with those sharp, knowing eyes and said, "Mommy, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, baby," Jasmine said automatically. But Elijah had picked up on it too, his face worried in that way that made him look far older than 7. "You look sad," he said. "Did something bad happen?" Jasmine took a deep breath and turned off the stove and sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for them to join her. And when they were settled, Gabriel on her left and Elijah on her right, she said, "Something surprising happened today, and I need to tell you about it because it affects all of us." The twins exchanged glances, communicating in that silent way they had, and then Gabrielle said, "Okay," and Elijah nodded, and Jasmine found herself stumbling over words she hadn't rehearsed, trying to explain the inexplicable. "You know how I've told you that your father wasn't ready to be a dad when you were born, that he had to go live his own life, and that's why he's not here. Well, today he came to see me at work, and he brought his other children with him, your brother and sister, Hannah and Henry. They're 5 years old and they just found out about you and they want to meet you. He wants you to meet them." And I said yes, that you could meet on Saturday, but only if you want to. If this is too much, if you're not ready, then we don't have to do it. We never have to do anything you don't want. There was a long silence during which Jasmine's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. And then Gabrielle said, in a small voice Jasmine had never heard from her, "Our dad wants to meet us. He came to see you. He knows about us." "Yes," Jasmine said. "He knows about you and he wants to. I think he wants to try to be part of your lives, if that's something you want." And Elijah, quiet Elijah who rarely asked for anything, who'd learned early to be content with what he had, said, "I want to meet him, Mommy. I want to meet my dad and my brother and sister." And Gabrielle nodded fiercely and said, "Me too." Jasmine pulled them both into a hug, breathing in the smell of their hair, the scent that meant safety and love and everything good in her life, and said, "Okay then. Saturday. We'll all meet and see what happens. But you need to know that whatever happens, whatever he says or does, you two are my whole world, and that will never change. Nothing he does can change how much I love you." "Promise," Elijah said. "Promise," Jasmine whispered into his hair, and she meant it with every cell in her body. Saturday arrived too fast and too slow at the same time. The days leading up to it marked by the twins' increasingly anxious questions. Gabrielle wanting to know what to wear and what to say and whether their dad would think they were smart. Elijah asking quieter questions about why Marcus had left, and whether it was because of something they did wrong, and each question was a knife in Jasmine's chest. But she answered them as honestly as she could, trying to be fair to Marcus, despite every instinct screaming at her to poison the well, to make sure the twins knew exactly what kind of man their father was. But that wasn't fair, she reminded herself. People could change. 5 years was a long time. Maybe Marcus really had become someone capable of being a father. Maybe she needed to give him the chance to prove it, if not for his sake, then for the twins who deserved to know their father, if he was willing to show up. She cleaned the apartment until it gleamed, moving furniture around to make the small space seem bigger, buying snacks she couldn't afford, and arranging them on plates like they were hosting royalty instead of a man who'd thrown her belongings in the garbage. Valencia came over at 1:30 to provide moral support, took one look at Jasmine's face and said, "You're allowed to be angry. You know, just because you're letting him see the kids doesn't mean you have to pretend to forgive him." "I'm not pretending anything," Jasmine said. "I'm doing what's best for Elijah and Gabriel. That's the only thing that matters." At exactly 2 o'clock there was a knock on the door, and Jasmine looked at her children, at Elijah in the button-down shirt they'd bought at the thrift store for school presentations, and Gabriel in her favorite purple dress with the twirly skirt, and said, "Ready." They nodded, holding hands again. And Jasmine opened the door to find Marcus standing in the hallway with Hannah and Henry, all of them looking nervous and hopeful and scared. And Jasmine thought, this is it. This is the moment where everything changes again. And all she could do was step back and let it happen.